Associate Dean, to welcome everybody and kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our commemoration week of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we celebrate and honor his legacy. Thank you all for attending. Hopefully you were able to attend yesterday and can attend the rest of the events later on this week. Once again, I want to thank our planning committee for all that they have done to make this week possible. And I will thank in advance all of our speakers and presenters. Thank you for being a part of today's program. I don't know if someone has the acknowledgement slide up. If not, I can go ahead and read it. So we always begin by honoring our Native, Indigenous, American Indians, and First Nations people. And so we want to honor and indicate that Washington University in St. Louis is located on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, Illinois Confederacy, and many other tribes who were removed unjustly, and that we are the beneficiaries of that removal. We honor them as we live, work, and study here at WashU School of Medicine in St. Louis. And again, before I turn it back over to Erin to, oh, there we go. Thank you, Erin, or whoever put that up. Thank you. Before I turn it back over, 2 things I want to mention. One is in terms of today's topic, and we talked yesterday about disinformation. And part of our goal is to try to correct many of the myths regarding critical race theory. I feel particularly strongly about this for my own dissertation, which I realize I completed now 20 years ago, which really focused on the experiences of faculty of color at predominantly white institutions. One of my underlying themes and theories was critical race theory. And as you know, more recently, CRT has come under attack. There's a lot of misinformation about it. And so we really want to begin a journey of trying to educate people around what critical race theory is, and more importantly, what it is not. As follow-up to today's program, we are actually going to have another program in February, and I will share up. Try to share my slide if someone will let me. I will share. I'm really excited that we are going to be welcoming, let's see if I can move this out of the way, Professor Kevin Brown, who was one of the originators in the room, who developed critical race theory, along with Kim Crenshaw, Kendall Thomas, Dr. Delgado. So they were the originators of critical race theory. And so he will be speaking to what critical race theory is and isn't, what was behind their thinking and coming up with it. And so you'll hear a presentation from him, and then we will also have plenty of time for conversation and Q&A. So that will be on February the 10th. This is part of our Inclusive Excellence Speaker Series. You will have an opportunity to RSVP because we do want to provide refreshments. So for now, please save the date, and we hope to see you there next month. So I will stop sharing, and I will turn it back over to Erin to move us forward.
If I can get my camera to come back on. What is going on? Oh, here we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Cherie. And without further ado, I am going to go ahead and jump right into introducing our panelists. I guess before I do that, just to kind of let you know how we're going to spend our time, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then what we're going to do is hear from them each for a few minutes to kind of tell us a little bit about kind of why, from their perspective and their expertise, they're going to hone in on specific things that we ask them to talk about. And then because they're brilliant and have been so fun to talk to, thought it would be really great to let them sort of just provide space for them to have a conversation together about the things that they hear each other sharing. And then we will also have time to take questions from our attendees. So there is a question and answer feature, and we encourage you to put questions in there throughout the time in case you don't want to forget. Somebody says something and you say, oh, I want to hear about that. We will definitely make space to try to answer some questions. So that's how we're going to spend our time together. what is hilarious is I've been so excited about this event for a long time, and still my least favorite thing is having to read in front of people because I inevitably mess something up. So as someone who tries to lead transformative culture change, I am going to model for you vulnerability and imperfection as I introduce these phenomenal women. And just say it's an honor to get to share some time with you today. First, I'm going to introduce Dr. Angel Jones. She is an educator, activist, and critical race scholar who uses creative methods such as hip hop and poetry to center the voices and experiences of the Black community. Her research explores the impact of racism on mental health with a focus on microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. Dr. Jones is also a public scholar who uses social media as an educational tool to increase access to academic scholarship. Dr. Jones has been interviewed by multiple media outlets, including Forbes, USA Today, and Insider, for expertise on racism in the United States. Dr. Jones is the president of the Critical Race Studies in Education Association. She is a proud first-generation college student who received a Ph.D. in education from George Washington University with a focus on inequality in higher education. She also has a Master's of Education, and I believe that's a doctorate in education, but you can correct me, I'm already messing up, in school counseling from Georgia State University, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Syracuse University. She is also a Brooklyn native and proud Afro-Latina. So welcome, Dr. Jones. We'll look forward to hearing from you. I'm introducing them in the order in which they will speak. So next we have Heather Fleming. She is an educator, diversity and inclusion trainer, and developer as an educational advocate and author. Her work is concentrated on helping people understand the systemic and personal barriers to racial conciliation and healing. Conciliation and healing. Heather is the founder and owner of In-Purpose Education. She works to provide high quality training and development for all those attending her webinars and seminars. She also plans events that give people an opportunity to discuss race in a safe environment and to make connections with others committed to creating equity in their communities. I'm kind of adding this in because we personally utilize Heather's book. So she's kind of a celebrity in particularly the STL community because of this great book called My Black Friend Says, Lessons in Equity, Inclusion, and Cultural Competency. It's a wonderful book and resource, and we actually use it in the YWCA has a community witnessing whiteness program, and our office, the School of Medicine, in partnership with BJH, does a workplace witnessing whiteness program, and we use her book as a resource to supplement some of the conversations that we have in the Witnessing Whiteness program. And so I just want to say St. Louis is beyond fortunate to have her, and she came rushing in after having to testify in the Senate for us today. So Heather's got a lot going on, and we're happy to have her. Last but certainly not least, we have Yetunde Jansky Ogunfidodo, and I may have said that wrong, but I want to really honor Tunde. She goes by Tunde for short, and she is an anti-oppression facilitator, trainer, consultant, and transformational coach, as well as visual performing artist and event producer, with the focus on dismantling systemic oppression, especially in the worlds of philanthropy and the arts. Driven by a love of meaningful experiences and a passion for equity and education, both locally and globally, and community building, Tunde has built a career creating and facilitating projects that make space for human connection, often involving elements of curation, convening, and collective visioning. Tunde facilitates anti-oppression training with NCCJ St. Louis, Crossroads Anti-Racism, and individual collaborators. She advises organizations and institutions to align their work with envisioning and creating more equitable and restorative projects, initiatives, spaces, and communities. She is also co-editor of the recently published Humans of St. Louis, shout out to Humans of St. Louis, their book, recently published book, and has served on the National Emerging Leader Council for Americans for the Arts, the steering committee of the Emerging Leaders in Philanthropy St. Louis chapter, and on various future crafting committees in and around the St. Louis region. She holds a BFA from Washington University in St. Louis, is a certified diversity facilitator with NCCJ St. Louis, and a certified Big Leap coach through the Hendricks Institute, and a certified urban Tantra practitioner. So you can see why we've invited each of these phenomenal women to be here. I did not introduce pronouns, which I will let you all do as you begin your talk. And I will pass the mic. Yeah, I love we're celebrating each other. Yay. And I am going to go ahead and pass the mic first to Dr. Jones. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Hey, y'all, I am Angel Jones. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya. And I love CRT, despite all the haters in the world. So I'm super excited to be able to talk to y'all about it today. And my job is just to give y'all a little bit of background information on CRT. So critical race theory is a framework that was birthed out of critical legal studies. And I won't go into CLS because y'all will have the amazing Kevin Brown here in a couple of weeks that will talk about it from that perspective. But the simplest form, I would say, it's a framework that acknowledges the roles that race and racism play within the systems in our country. And that can be the educational system, the injustice system, healthcare system, all the different systems, right? It really forces us to look at the roles that race and racism are playing. It now is in many other fields, not just legal studies, including education, which is what I will focus on. And it was introduced originally to the field of education by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings and Dr. William Tate, just really talking about, okay, how do we acknowledge and really dig into how racism is playing a role within the oppression experienced by our students within the educational field. I am sorry they decided to take out the trash right now. So if y'all hear that in the background, see, I feel like they're hating on CRT, right? Like that's just what happens. So when I think about CRT and education, Dr. Danny Tolorsino came up with 5 tenets that kind of describe CRT in education specifically. The first one talks about the prevalence of racism. In this country, racism is really entrenched within the fabric of this country. We see it all over. We see it in everything, despite the attempts of folks to either deny its existence or ban students from learning about it and things of that nature. CRT really talks about the prevalence and permanence of racism, specifically in the United States. The second tenet is really us challenging false dominant narratives and ideologies. Because we're talking about MLK specifically, I'll give you an example. So when we think about the false notion of meritocracy or the bootstrap theory, this idea like, oh, all you have to do is pull yourselves up by the bootstraps. In one of Dr. King's speech, he talks about that it is cruel just to expect a bootless man to pull himself up by the bootstraps, right? But in this country, we say, oh, if you work hard, then you can make it, right? So if you're not doing well, it's not because you're oppressed, it's because you're just not working hard enough. And that is a false narrative that we push back against. I also think about this idea that we are in a post-racial society where racism is no longer an issue. Folks act because we had a Black president and a Black vice president, poof, racism no longer exists. But that is not true. We do not live in a post-racial society. So using a framework like CRT forces us to acknowledge that and push back against those false narratives. The third tenet is the value of experiential knowledge, and really being intentional about centering the voices and experiences of marginalized folks. Oftentimes when it comes to laws or policies or narratives, folks of color, BIPOC communities are pushed to the margin, are silent, are ignored, our stories are twisted. So with CRT, using that as a framework, we are intentional about centering their voices and understanding that their experiences are valid. Right. So when folks think about data and numbers and things like that, for us, experiences count as data, right? Because if this is what they're experiencing, it is as valid as any other form of data. The fourth tenet is really taking a interdisciplinary approach to this work. So yes, we're in education, but we also think about history. We think about psychology. We think about sociology, right? So how can we, from many different fields and disciplines, really get together to address oppression and the things that are happening within this country? And the final tenet is a commitment to social justice. We are intentional about making sure that our work has a purpose outside of just putting something on our CVs, right? Or just something to pontificate about at conferences and things like that, right? There are plenty of researchers and faculty members and educators that do research and embark on this work for themselves, or just for the sake of knowledge. And I'm not saying doing things just for the sake of knowledge is wrong, but as critical race scholars, we are intentional about our research, our work, our teaching. The main purpose is to advocate for social justice, right? We want change to happen because it doesn't make sense to acknowledge the roles that race and racism are playing within our systems and then not do something intentionally to combat that. So that's kind of critical race theory in education in a nutshell.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. We can kind of pause. I like to go off script sometimes to see if either of our other panelists have a question or a follow-up for anything that Dr. Jones shared before we jump into Heather's piece. Was there anything that came up that you want to talk about now? Yeah.
Can I just add one thing that I love to hear? Like, I love it when people talk about bootstraps theory and the way that plays into the myth of meritocracy. I learned a few years ago from a fellow facilitator that phrase was meant to be an idiom. It was introduced into English language in the same way that, like, when pigs fly was. It is something that is known to be physically impossible, and it was just misappropriated and has now become a way that we imagine things are meant to be done, but we've always known that that success is possible within and with community and support. And so just wanted to mention that.
Thank you so much. All right, well, Heather, why don't we pass the mic to you? Welcome.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to share my screen very quickly and then see if I can get this slideshow started. So I am realizing that I need to update my bio because a couple things got left out. And that's my fault. And one of the things is that when we began this whole thing about critical race theory and attempting to ban critical race theory in our schools, I began the Missouri Equity Education Partnership in order to respond to that. And so that was the capacity that I was testifying in today before the Missouri State Senate, as they have presented SB 4 and SB 89 that are supposedly Parents' Bill of Rights, but you know, which parents pretty much. And then it also attempts to ban CRT and the 1619 Project, et cetera, and DEI work. So the primary argument that I hear from people is that critical race theory isn't taught in schools. And I want us to begin avoiding this argument, because what it does is that it implies that there is something wrong with discussing race and racism and equity. And so we may not be formally teaching some of the stuff, but if you listen to what Dr. Jones said, who, oh my gosh, you're so brilliant and I love you already. If you listen to what Dr. Jones is saying, these are things that are very common sense. And yes, if we are educators and we have diverse classrooms, or even if we don't have diverse classrooms, these are things that we still need to be talking about and trying to do. And so we want to get away from that argument. Instead, what we need to do is define and don't deflect. One of the things, the other capacity is that my work with the Missouri Equity Education Partnership has also led me to a role as a senior organizer with the African American Policy Forum. The African American Policy Forum is the think tank started by critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And so I get to work with KC every day and listen to her, Dr. Crenshaw, and listen to her wonderful words all the time. And so one of the things that she said is that it is a way of seeing, attending to, accounting for, tracing, and analyzing the ways that race is produced, the ways that racial inequality is facilitated, and the ways that our history has created these inequalities that now can be almost effortlessly reproduced unless we attend to the existence of these inequalities. So just like Dr. Jones was saying, we've got to be intentional in centering Black voices, in centering Black experiences, and in talking about and addressing these inequalities. And what I think is so ironic is that right now efforts to ban critical race theory actually prove it. So some of the other aspects and big sub theories that come from critical race theory, of course, is the discussion of systemic racism. Systemic racism is how we use our systems to create inequity, and how our systems have been set up to create inequity. Well, what more inequity is there than putting laws in place that say we can't discuss certain people's experiences in our country? We can't examine how those experiences came to be, and we can't examine the impact of those experiences on entire communities. The next one is the race reform retrenchment redux. Basically, we tackle a race issue, we issue some reform around it, and then there's always this retrenchment where people want to pull us back to it. And so therefore, racial reform and progress is not something that's very linear. Sometimes it feels like one step forward, 7 steps back. And so in trying to say, hey, we can't talk about critical race theory in our classroom, you're actually proving this because it's the retrenchment process. We're going to stop talking about race so that we don't have any reform that then leads us to better racial relations and to lesser inequities. As also part of it, we have the critique of colorblindness, which it was mentioned today. It blew my mind. I had already done a speech where I said, I watched some of you post on Monday, but before I even get a chance to say that today, one of the senators sponsoring the bill got up and said, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how we should be judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. That's where colorblind philosophy and rhetoric came from. And they always refer to that. The problem is that they skip over everything else that he said. And the reality is what critical race theory shows us, as well as what Dr. King himself taught, is that equity and justice are the ways for us to achieve the end goal, which is equality. But we can't skip steps and just say we're equal. So critique of colorblindness, critique of formal equality. When we get into some of the stuff, it's again, this whole thing that, well, you know what? Everyone is equal under the law. When we look at laws on paper, yeah, it doesn't say, well, white people or Black people. The problem is, and where we need to critique and to have a critical eye, is on the fact that even if there's formal equality, there's not de facto equality. And so critical race theory calls for us to talk about that. The critique of neutrality. I won't get into all of these, but the big one that I also want to just really talk about is both sidesism. We saw this. We saw when Texas implemented one of the first anti-critical race theory laws, there were school districts that interpreted as, hey, when you're talking about the Holocaust, you got to make sure to bring in both sides. So we got to be fair to the Nazis when we talk about the Holocaust. So there's that both sidesism ends up coming and being something that we examine and critique with critical race theory. I'm going to skip that. So just some tips when we are talking about critical race theory and how to define it. Critical race theory is teaching the true and accurate history of America and how injustices from the past create inequality for some people today. Critical race theory is the best way to combat division and promote unity by equipping our children with the tools they need to thrive in a diverse world. Hopefully those are statements that most people will not disagree with. But what I don't want people to do is to say, hey, critical race theory isn't taught in K through 12 schools, okay? Because what they will then start listing is critical race theory in practice. And the reality is anytime we examine any law, like for instance, when we talk about the Dred Scott case, we can't talk about the Dred Scott case without talking about Judge Roger Taney saying that the Black man had no rights, that the white man was bound to respect, and how we still see some of this present within our society today, okay? In doing that, we're practicing critical race theory. Do not use alternative terms. So we can say that critical race theory is teaching accurate history, but we don't need to avoid critical race theory. And then we don't want to say that parents should not have a say in what their children learn. Parents should have to say. That's a framework that parents should have a say in what they, and we don't want to fall for people that are talking negatively about CRT and therefore reinforce what they're saying. So I would say talking about this, number one, understanding. Teaching the impacts of racism in American history helps children understand why injustice exists for some people in America today. Appreciation, learning about the contributions of people of color in American history makes children appreciate diversity in America today. And then compassion, learning how ordinary Americans stood up to injustice throughout history creates compassion and courage for children to forge a more just society today. And Tunde, I promise this is it, and then I'm done, okay? So why is it important to teach CRT and equity in medicine? Because it is literally a matter of life and death, all right? I was just able to look at a few scholarly articles just to get this information, and there were still so many more. There's a lot of research around the fact that when we don't examine our biases, some of the situations that we see here happen. So maternity mortality rates for Black women are 3 to 5 times higher than for white women. Black Americans are systematically undertreated for pain relative to white Americans. They actually, one survey I saw said that in situations where there is something broken, that white Americans were 72% likely to receive some type of pain medication, where Black Americans were only 47% likely. Imagine that you're sitting there and you have a broken arm, a broken bone, and people won't give you pain medication to manage it. Black Americans receive lower quality care, even when insurance status, income, age, and severity of condition are exactly the same. The rates at which Black patients' limbs are amputated is much higher than for white patients. After surgery, Black patients are discharged from the hospital earlier than white patients. Black women are much less likely than white women to receive radiation treatment after a mastectomy. So for some, and we can go, like I said, on and on when we talk about high blood pressure and trauma caused by racism, et cetera, we can go on and on, but this is the bottom line. Understanding your biases will save lives, period. So Moeep, me, we have 4 roles: advocacy, education, activism, and support. And then here's all of our stuff. If you want to follow us, etc. I don't understand the TikTok yet, but I'm trying. So hang with us, okay? All right, and that's it. How do I stop share? All right. And Tunde, take it away.
Okay, so like I do feel a little bit like that we need to be like, yeah, and the crowd goes wild, right? And also we'll say that we will share any information that you all want us to share with the participants after this in a follow-up email. So to those of to those of you that are attending and are like, wait, I didn't get all of that, we'll follow up with an email. I also did just want to make the same kind of space for some immediate reactions, because you're all sharing a lot of great stuff. So just to kind of take a pause and see if there's anything that either one of you wanted to like amplify, you know, respond to, add to before we hear from our final panelist. All right.
Well, I did want to say one thing, and I'll use it as a segue. Actually, I wanted to say thank you for emphasizing to stay away from deflecting, educating over deflecting, because I will totally admit that I am a person who's been guilty of deflecting in the past. There are moments where that feels easier than engaging in a conversation when you're spending time and trying to educate, where you're simply trying to help someone like make the right decision, not see this really vital theory as a threat to their child. So thank you for that. I come to this work as a storyteller and someone who is so passionate about the power of storytelling and the impact that storytelling can have on people's decision-making process. And in this conversation, I think a lot about the impact of storytelling and on the power of narrative on the voting populace and on the decision-making populace, both in terms of the tenets of critical race theory, as well as on the backlash that we've seen happen in critical race theory. I am a first-generation Nigerian American queer disabled woman, and there are ways that my identities intersect and show up that are impacted by many parts of this conversation. And so I'm going to start off with just referencing a person who I admire very much in her work and her conversation about the importance and power of narrative, who is author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So we have two actually short snippets that we'd like to share. We're going to share this first one, and then I'll give a little bit of commentary, and then we'll share the second one, and then I'll follow up after that. There we go.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in Eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are.
Thank you so much, Joel. So when we talk about critical race theory and the national conversation that is happening right now, what we're actually talking about is addressing the single story about the curation of American identity and about the ability of people within this country to thrive and live and exist. When we are in these conversations, those 5 tenets are meant to address a single story that is incorrect, that we have been given, that has created as well as withheld power. And when we talk about power, that is where the conversation gets a little scary, because when we talk about power, we also are talking about resources. We are also talking about the decisions that are made in terms of like the governing of our country. Another thing, though, is that we're just talking about the right to exist and a human being's autonomy. And that's something that has been historically denied through this single story of how we got to where we are today. When we forget about the history, when we accept the incorrect history that we are taught, what we find is that we just can't figure out why some people are poor. We just can't figure out why some people are unhealthy. As a disabled person during this past 3 years of the pandemic, I've found myself listening to these conversations about those of us who are at a higher risk of COVID. And there's folks who are just at a higher risk because of their blood sugar. There's folks who are just at a higher risk because of heart conditions. What causes that? Where does that come from? There are answers if we actually look to the way that people have been treated, the way that resources are intentionally bestowed and withheld within our country. So this next part, which is going to be about 3.5 minutes, she is going to talk a little bit about power. So if we could bring that in.
The African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind: the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler and Updike and Steinbeck and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America.
Thank you so much. So I just want to add to this, that this conversation, the pushback that we have seen around critical race theory and the pushback that we have seen around properly educating children in schools about the history of this country is less about the impact on the individual child and more about the fear of changing the singular story of America. Is more about the fear of the way that power might be redistributed if we all had a proper understanding of, not secondly, the inequities that exist for Black and Brown people within this country. We're not quite sure why, but if we started the story with firstly, folks being brought to this country against their will, firstly, folks not having the ability to be compensated for labor, not having the ability to survive, thrive, receive healthcare, et cetera. What would happen if we started the story with firstly? So I'll end with just this quote that she goes further on in the talk and says, "The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue." So some of those points that I just raised, the increased risk to African Americans during the pandemic, the fact that for many of us, building wealth has been difficult. They're not untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And the consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. And that is the goal that is being addressed in critical race theory. Thank you.
Yay.
Wow.
Yeah,
Thank you
please
for
just
that.
react. I want this.
Thank you for that. Wow. I'm using it next time I testify, by the way. 2 days say it.
So just thank you. And I do want to just create some space for the three of you to sort of engage in conversation around what's been shared. I think, first of all, just the reframe, Heather, that you provided in terms of, I know I have, that was like a first response, like, we're not teaching critical race theory K through 12, you know, and that's something that has been, and so the reframe of that perpetuates the idea that it's to be afraid of or scary or negative, was really, really powerful. And I wonder, you know, if you might expand on that a little more. And then, like I said, the three of you have been presented such important information. I just kind of wanted to take a step back and let you talk to each other. I don't want to say allow space for you to engage with one another, kind of about what we just heard from each of you.
Yeah, that actually was the result of course, someone is ringing the doorbell here. We're in the office where I am. But that actually came from research. What they found was that individuals, when you actually explained it, they were like, oh, well, yeah, I agree with that. But what happened is that we had a political operative named Christopher Rufo that made the decision and announced that he was going to make critical race theory toxic. And he partly depended on the fact that no one really knew what it was. And so we could take this term and we could let people apply whatever meaning to it that they wanted. And so that is one of the reasons why we do need to learn a little bit more and we need to define it.
I think, don't get me started on Rufo or the rest of his haters. Because so many folks don't know what CRT is, and I love this idea of reframing, right? So I always tell folks, like, I'm not going to tell you what CRT isn't, I'm going to tell you what CRT is, right? Because if I sit here and spend time trying to debunk every single myth, I would have no time to do everything else that I need to do, right? So whatever myths or falsehoods that you've created or heard or continue to regurgitate because you don't want to read a book, that's not my business, right? My business as a crit scholar, as president of my org, is to stick to the facts, right? This is what CRT is, not this is what CRT is not. So I think that is a really important distinction for us to realize. And just talking about storytelling, like I love storytelling. Counter storytelling specifically is such an important tenet of critical race theory that allows us to push back and to center our stories and kind of challenge, right, those false dominant narratives and ideologies that we talked about. But what I love about counter storytelling, right, it's not just the stories we tell, but it's how we tell those stories that challenges what counts as scholarship, that challenges what counts as research, as the dissemination of data, right? So I think about my dissertation, when I presented, I did it as a spoken word piece. Because I'm like, I'm going to do it as a counter story. I'm going to share the stories of these incredible women as a spoken word piece. And I wanted, if I'm going to become Dr. Jones, I'm going to become that as my most authentic self, which for me happens to be through spoken word. I've made counter stories using letter writing, right? So like my research originally looked at how Black women respond to microaggressions. And we often don't respond. So I did it as a letter as Black women responding to their microaggressors. I've done them as a diary entry. I've done them as hip hop songs, right? So counter storytelling to me is beautiful because we're not just challenging the narrative, we're also challenging how we get to present our narrative and our stories.
So can I ask you, Dr. Jones, just to talk a little bit, maybe provide some context around what counter storytelling is for folks who may not be familiar. And then there is a question about who is Rufo. I don't know if we want to we don't want to give too much space.
I don't want to get too deep into that.
But maybe just a little bit of.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe just a quick background on that. And then if you could just talk a little bit more about what you mean around counter storytelling. I think you gave some great examples, but.
Yeah, so Christopher Rufo, I would say he's one of the, I don't want to say first because folks have been hating on CRT for a long time. He's one of the loudest opponents of CRT, and he's kind of the one that created the false narrative around what CRT is and isn't, and then all the folks who follow him, all the right-wingers and things of that nature kind of bought into that. And he's been using CRT, I would say, as this umbrella term to include anything race-based. So he kind of is what set the hatred ball rolling. But he's not the first one. He's just the loudest and the wrongest. But
Mhm.
anyway, so that's Christopher Rufo. If you can Google him, watch videos of him espousing his foolishness. But onto the fun stuff. So counter stories. So they are stories that center the lived experiences of folks of color. And we're specifically challenging false narratives, right? So there's just storytelling, which is us telling our stories, but counter storytelling specifically is about us pushing back, like countering the dominant narrative that's out there. And I think both are important, but when we're talking about CRT, we're talking about counter storytelling. So for me, like I said, one of the dominant narratives that CRT pushes back against is this idea of us living in a post-racial society, right? So when I create my counter stories about the experiences of Black women in higher education, I'm very clear with, no, these are the things that Black women are experiencing. These are the things that Black students are experiencing, right? So my work looks at racial battle fatigue, which is a term that was coined by Dr. William A. Smith out of the University of Utah. And it talks about both the psychological and physiological consequences of experiencing racism on a consistent, prolonged basis. So those psychological consequences are decreased self-esteem, increased depression, increased suicidal thoughts, and so on. But there are also these physical manifestations in our body. So Black folks and other folks of color typically have things like increased blood pressure, elevated heart rate, tension headaches, stomach ulcers, which in the medical community, I think is really important for folks to know and understand that when people of color, folks in the Black community are coming to physicians with certain symptoms, it's important for y'all to know what racial battle fatigue is, right? So when I'm talking about this and I'm creating their stories, I'm being intentional about saying, one, racism does exist and racism is deadly, right? So kind of what Heather is saying, like it is literally a life or death situation, and ignoring the fact that we are not in a post-racial society harms Black folks, their physical health, their psychological health, and just their overall well-being. And counter stories help us to put that story at the forefront.
That's absolutely brilliant. I also wanted to clarify something though. When I say define, don't defend, I definitely am not advocating for us to go around just, I got to educate everyone. That's our job. It's not our job, okay? But what I am saying is that when you are in a position where you have to discuss CRT for whatever reason, you're defending your use of it or whatever, that it is best just to define it and not deflect from it. The other thing that I really want to stress is that when you are discussing this, don't repeat the points that someone in opposition are making. And the reason why is because what that does, as opposed to people being like, oh, they said not to believe this, it actually reinforces the negative information or the misinformation, disinformation in their minds. And so what we need to continue to do is, just like Dr. Jones was saying, is that we need to continue to be like, this is what CRT is, and this is why I believe that we need to, have this in our classrooms, in our universities, etc., but don't reinforce their points in the process.
Kind of building off of that, Heather, we have a question in chat saying, could you explain the significance of the statement, we aren't teaching CRT in K through 12? Are we not hoping that CRT will be taught in K through 12?
Well, I think that Dr. Jones really made an excellent, she was talking about stuff and then I brought up some things. We're not sitting second graders down and going, hey, do you know what retrenchment is, sweetie? That's what I mean by, necessarily we're not teaching it, but what we have to realize, and it's again, reinforcing something that both Tunde and Dr. Jones kind of addressed, is that right now we have to realize everything that they're trying to encapsulate within it and everything that they're trying to make, off limits and faux pas to discuss. And so it is not necessarily CRT that we are the formalized, upper graduate level theory, legal theory that we are discussing, but we are looking at that in practice. And in the end, like all of the, as Tundi was talking about, all of the, things related to race and culture and stories, our stories and our experiences that will come into the classroom. And so we do want that. We want that all the way. Like I work with organizations, We Stories, they talk to parents about here's how you use literature to begin discussing race. Excellent. And they teach you how to start doing it with kids that are 2, 3 years old. There's excellent books out there. So we also have to look at all of the ways that they're trying to do what Tunde is saying, which is really stop us from having the discussions that may lead to the redistribution of power, that may lead to really, in the way that I usually say it, is redefining who we the people is, because traditionally within our country, we the people has applied to a small portion of individuals. And what happens is that we get some racial progress or some progress so that we can widen the definition. But there are people that are like, wait a minute, it can't get too wide. It can't, wait a minute, too many people in here. And so that's what we want to have in the classroom, is the ability for our children to have these critical conversations about race and racism and systems and power, et cetera. So I hope that answered the question. I really do.
Thank you so much for that clarity. It was a big help.
You're welcome.
I wanted to add a little bit to that, so everything that Heather just said, that the enactment of the tenets of critical race theory might be different than teaching the entire theory, but it is still CRT in practice. And it also, that question and that big conversation often makes me think about the idea of neutrality, because the other thing that I hear a lot that is embedded in that is that children are being taught something extra, something more, something that is like different than what they should be taught. And and that is coming from this like notion of neutrality that comes from the singular story. Just like Chimamanda was saying, she thought that stories were supposed to be about little white British children drinking tea in the snow, coming from Nigeria, a country where, like, when my father came to this country, he experienced snow for the first time in his adulthood, and it was wild to him. And so when we have this idea that this is what normalcy is, this is what we should be talking about, it is already indicating that we are leaving out so much of the culture that makes up the fabric of this country, the many cultures that make up the fabric of this country. And so one of the things that I often find myself responding is that there is a richness. There is so much knowledge, richness, and understanding in children who are raised with awareness of other cultures and with awareness of the experiences of other people. And we're not talking about whether or not like a child might feel bad about a true horrendous thing that has happened in our history. What's on the other side is that is a child who is ignorant to the richness that exists around them, to the wealth of like history and knowledge and strength and amazing cultures that have contributed to this space that they're walking on. So that's another way to not necessarily repeat the messaging, but to address it.
So that was so huge. I just wanted to like really amplify that, because I know that we always are trying to make this feel very real for people, that this is not something that happens like outside of us, like in other parts of the country. Like we're in Missouri, where I believe we have the most legislation around trying to stop these conversations. So us having an understanding of that is just so critically important. And we saw schools in our state standing there saying, you're hurting white children by telling them the truth about our history. And I just kind of wanted to like amplify what you just said, that to me, a part of, because we're talking about storytelling and narrative, is how are we preparing children to be successful in a world that is increasingly diverse and to see only a singular experience as valuable, right? So just that we do all of our children a disservice. And I would like to kind of zoom it into medical education, given that that's kind of what we do here. And to say that as we think about some of the pushback that we've seen as our gateway curriculum has a health, equity, and justice thread, and we try to amplify more stories and to skill up practitioners for serving an increasingly diverse population. And there is a discomfort that happens with white folks, folks who carry privileged identities. And I wanted to, I think what we're bumping up against is honoring the importance of the experiences as data. And we're trying to increasingly create space where BIPOC students, students that have minoritized or marginalized identities, even feel comfortable sharing their story, right? So I just wanted to circle back to something that you said, Dr. Jones, around experiences count as data. And I'm doing so because, we're a science-based institution. It's always like, show me the data, show me the data. Well, we got lots of data about inequities around race and marginalization. And yet it's still hard to push the conversation at a larger scale. And so I wondered if you could speak to that, because I think that also ties in with this idea of storytelling and narrative being so important. Can you talk about why experiences count as data and how we might do a better job of utilizing those experiences data, if you will?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the person in the question. I will respond to that one afterwards. Just I don't want y'all to think that we're ignoring your question by any means. So I am a qualitative researcher. So stories are what I care about. And that's not to say numbers are important, but stats make my stomach hurt. So that's just not my ministry. I specifically love storytelling and interviews and things of that nature. And I get very frustrated when people act as if those stories are not valid, as if that doesn't count as data, but I feel like it's so rich and valuable, right? So if someone's taking a survey, like, yes, you're going to get an answer, but you get the what and not the why, right? And I think when we do interviews, focus groups, and qualitative data, when we're talking about stories and experiences, we get the why behind of it, which I feel like really helps us to acknowledge that commitment to social justice, right? When one of the tenets of CRT. But I realize that I don't think that people don't care about experiences. They don't care about the experiences of BIPOC folks, right? Like, let's be completely clear about that, because folks will regurgitate the false dominant narratives day in and day out, and they value those, they raise them, they honor them. So they do care about experiences and stories. It's just our experiences and stories that don't count as data. So I just want to name that because I feel like that is important. But I think that folks often ignore it. So for example, there was a town hall at my doctoral institution. George Washington University, I'm not going to protect them, right? And they were having a town hall about racism and how it exists within the Graduate School of Education. And our dean at the time said something to the fact like, "Oh, I didn't know that, there's no data there." And then someone called him out. I was like, actually, Dr. Jones did a whole dissertation about the racism that's experienced here. Y'all just don't want to look at it, right? So there is data, and I would challenge y'all to rethink about what you think counts as data. Do you have a hierarchy in your mind, right, in terms of what counts more, and then really challenge yourself to ask yourself why, right? Like, why do you believe certain things, and how can you be intentional about rethinking and reimagining what data is, what scholarship is, and what is and is not important.
Thank you so much. I do, to your point, I do want to make sure that we answer the question, which is, and you can all respond if you have thoughts, but how do we actually change the mindset of people like the person we talked about before? It's a huge thing for me, is to just try not to repeat things, but that we aren't helpful. And are there trainings in place for people who want to engage in CRT in their classrooms?
So I'll tackle this one. Here's the reality. It takes a long time to change mindsets. What has been shown, research has shown, is the best way to change those mindsets is through relationship. But we have to accept that there's just some people who won't change that mindset. And that's on them. They're gonna always be on that political side. So what we have to concentrate on are those people that do have the ability to listen, and in the end, spur them to action. And we don't really have the time that it would take in order to change everyone's mindset. So when it comes to like your parents or something like that, if they have that mindset and you want to begin talking to them and engaging in conversations with them about it, it is through relationship that some of those mindsets are changed. But otherwise, I'm not sure if there are ways that we can. It's not going to be just we sit down, we have a really great conversation, and that person is like, you know what, you're right. Because they have to go with like what they value. They have to change some of the things that they value as important and significant. They have to change like their whole way of thinking, and in some cases, their whole way of doing life. And that's going to take more than just one or two conversations. Now, are there trainings in place for people who want to engage in CRT in their classrooms? This is what they're terming CRT, DEI work. That is the reason for this pushback. That's the race reform retrenchment redux. The reason for the pushback is because of the fact that our schools were moving in the direction, and have been for a very long time, of teaching teachers how to implement DEI perspective, DEI practices within their classroom. And so that is the reason why I'm here. Is I left teaching in 2018 so that I could do this type of training, because I loved it. I love talking to people. I love the relationships that I developed. I loved all of that. And then all of a sudden it was just smack. Oh my gosh, we can't do this. And so I know that we've offered training. Some people have taken our training, maybe even on this call, but in the end, yes, a lot of schools are examining diversity, equity, and inclusion. And because of that, that is why we're seeing some of this pushback.
I would say I have a somewhat controversial opinion when it comes to this. Like the first question, like, how do we change his mind? I would say that we don't. I always say that my job is to educate, not change minds. Right? I'm going to give you the information, and what you do with that has nothing to do with me and everything to do with you. And there have been plenty of times where folks have changed their mind after taking one of my trainings or listening to one of my lectures or classes, because the truth is what changes minds, not people. Right? So, because there are a lot of folks who follow Rufo and other folks that have the stance they have on CRT because they don't know the facts. But once they learn the facts, they're like, oh, I don't have a problem with that. And I was like, yeah, right. So the truth changes minds and hearts and all of those things. I don't think that that's my job. I'm an educator. I will educate you. I'll provide you with the facts. And I think that goes into the second question, right, about trainings. So I do, of course, the DEI stuff, but I do CRT training specifically, right? So I've done them with teachers, right? So what does it look like to use CRT? And we kind of talked about it earlier, right? There's a difference, I believe, between your teaching being rooted in CRT and you teaching CRT. Right? Those are not the same thing. So you as a teacher, especially like if you're a middle school teacher, right? Your teaching can be rooted in CRT. And what you teach and how you show up, but you're not teaching theory to these 11-year-olds. So I've done that. I've taught CRT to mental health professionals, right? So what does it look like for us to take a CRT lens when approaching, your clients in psychology and things like that? I've done it in law spaces, right? So what does it look like to specific, like, of course, there are going to be tenets that are similar, but what does it look like to actually apply it to your work and your specific field?
I have a third potentially controversial opinion on this. And when we're talking about like how we change hearts and minds, so I think it's my job. That is my job. I am like, I can absorb research. I will not spend my life doing research. I am here to have the conversations with the human beings and translate that research into something that they can understand, and encourage them to have that same conversation with other people in their life. And I think that it is the combination of truth and relationship, and activating people to utilize truth in their relationships that is actually going to get us where we need to be. And I also think that the revolution takes all kinds. And so there's people out tearing shit down. Oh my goodness, excuse me. There's people out building it up, and there are the dreamers, and we all are involved in this process together. So when I think about this work, I think that like, how are you changing someone's minds? I think you're starting with your closest people. Because, we love an internet conversation. We love to get out there and like yell at the stranger on Facebook, but are you having this conversation at your holiday dinner table? That thing that feels the scariest, that thing that you're like, I just don't have capacity to do. I can train all these other people, but like I have to talk to my therapist before I can have this conversation with my mom. That is your most powerful. That's like the most impact that you can potentially have. That person loves you, cares about you, and has potential. As much as you activate each other, they also have the potential to hear you in a way that they will not hear another person whose story is not intrinsically and often, not always, because family looks different for everyone, but is often genetically tied to them. Like, that's the person who you have the most potential to change, and that part feels hard. Oppression is a system where we are all involved in it. Some of us are targeted by it so much more. Like, I know that I feel this in my life. I know that like many of us on the screen feel this in our lives in different ways than other people. And even folks who benefit from it can feel the pressure to continue to participate in it and have the ability to like learn, to unlearn, and to impact other people who look like them. So I'm about like collecting everybody so that we got all the people doing the work.
Thank you so
I
much.
love that. You're so right. I just want to say that I tell my people, ruin Thanksgiving. Go ahead. Have that talk. Ruin Thanksgiving, girl. Ruin Christmas. Ruin all of it. So you have to have the talk, and you engage in it on a regular basis. So yes, thank you, Tunde. I love that. Thank you, Dr. Jones.
So I think Cherie has her hand up and wanted to ask a question.
Thank you. I was attempting to put this in the chat, and for some reason I couldn't do it. I'm one of those people who does push back on, we don't teach this in K through 12, because, I think about the way I learned about critical race theory in grad school, right? If we don't teach, that's not what we're teaching. So Dr. Jones, I really appreciated your clarification and differentiating between what happens, because I feel like what's happened, and Heather, you spoke to this, is that people are conflating CRT with DEI work. And they're putting it under this entire umbrella and now trying to ban all of that. And so I do think part of our responsibility, whether we like it or not, and that's one of the reasons why we want to do this program, is to educate people on what CRT is. the actual CRT and the way that we can or cannot apply it. The other thing I wanted to mention, Erin asked the question about, sort of how this can relate particularly to students of color. And I still remember one of the first articles that Mary Howard Hamilton, my advisor, shared with me around CRT, spoke to this concept of counter spaces, right? And particularly for people of color from other perhaps underrepresented populations, this sense of creating a space where we can come together and talk with people about our own experiences. It may be a physical space, and maybe let's get together here. And that's something I think that's really critical, that we try to create those opportunities and spaces for individuals. So just wanted to throw that out. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cherie. Just wanted to make sure that we heard kind of a last word from each of you. And also, given that our office is tasked with the culture change around this place, and really just wanted to thank you for mentioning and make the connection for our audience that this work takes time. In academic medicine, there's a real pressure for like, fix it, give me the answer and keep it moving. And that's not this work. And so I just couldn't resist using the platform to say that. I say nearly every time we start a session, this work is relational. We have to build relationships because we can hold each other accountable more when we know we care and care about one another and respect one another. And then also just that it takes time to change culture, that we don't have the 3 steps to dismantling oppression that everyone can, like, we know how to do it, but it takes time. And so just really asking the attendees, one of the things you can do is take advantage of the education, the programs, and make space and time for the people that you manage to engage in these conversations and trainings, because it does take time and it builds over time. And with that, I just wanted to ask each of you to maybe give us kind of a very brief, one last action item that our attendees could take in terms of just learning more or in a way to engage. And then Polly, I will ask you to come on screen and close us out. And just can't say thanks enough for you all being here. It's been an honor to share a screen. Yeah, let's go in order as we started, if that's okay.
Sure. I would say do your homework. There's so much to learn when it comes to CRT. I took it for an entire semester. I've been reading books and books and books and books. And I just feel like I think it's important to, talk to the people in your family and have conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But don't sit at the table and think that you are now a critical race scholar because you came to this talk. And I feel like a lot of people do that. And then it makes it hard for people like me that do this work every single day to then have to kind of tell people the truth, right? So I think it's important. So if you're having conversations with people in your family, I think that's great, but pointing them to resources, right? Whether it's a video of our talk today, right? Or a certain book or a certain article from folks that actually do this work. So yes, have those conversations about oppression, power, privilege, and all of those things. But one talk does not make you an expert, or any of us, well, whatever. Don't sit at the table, right? And think that you're all of a sudden a critical race scholar.
I first want to thank WashU for bringing me into the presence of such beautiful, brilliant colleagues. I really appreciate it. I would say that if I have one takeaway, I would get involved. And that is at every level, because right now it's under attack at every level. And when we say that it's under attack, what we're really saying is what Tunde was talking about, which is that really what's under attack is power structures, no, not power structures being under attack, but what's under attack is our ability to expand power, to redistribute power, to bring our experiences in, to tell our stories. And so you have to stand with others who are saying, no, we do want this in our neighborhoods. We do want this for our communities, for our schools, for our students, because in the end, we're going to end up with a bunch of kids that aren't prepared, again, for living in a diverse world. And no matter what, whether they want it or not, we're a diverse world. And we're already here. We're already here. So basically, it's, are we going to live together well or not? And so get involved. That's what I would say.
And then I would actually add to those like really brilliant pieces of advice to move with humility. And especially if you are a person who benefits from the system of oppression. If you are a white person or a white passing person and you are working to go out and talk to people, if you have learned something and are trying to have a conversation, recognize that that person that you're talking to, you've probably been on your own learning journey where they are right now, and it is not helpful to us for you to engage with them with righteous anger. Like, just leave that for us. And recognize that like you are, the gift that you can play is engaging with this person in a way that they can potentially understand. And you don't have to win, like it's just a moment and it's a conversation. They may not completely understand by the time you walk away from that, but it is helpful to like take that capacity that you have to use it to engage another human being, to bring them along on the journey.
Thank you all. On behalf of the Equity Champions, the MLK Week Committee, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Angel Jones, Heather Fleming, and Tunde Jansky of Longidodo for being here today. Like you all mentioned, we can't do this work alone, and we need all of you at the table. Sign up for all of our different trainings like Diversity 1.0 to 4.0. Come to us. We need your support. You need us too. And we're so excited that you were here. Fill out the evaluation. It will be dropped in the chat, or you may get it through an email. There are more events this week. We hope you can come. We have Yoga for Self-Compassion with Collective STL tomorrow. We have Amplifying Black Voices for Community and Healing tomorrow at 11. And remember to support our organizations in the community like The Brick and Unstoppable Extended Hands. Check out our website, check what they do. They're really doing really neat work in supporting our Black and Brown communities. And finally, save the date for Kevin Brown on February 10th. Again, I thank you all for taking time, participating today, and we hope to see you tomorrow.